What's up guys, it's Z here, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the meta with the conclusion of YCS Charlotte. We pretty much have enough data to take a look at the format and see exactly which decks are the most dominant ones. And I have to say that pretty much everything we expected was mostly what was there. We saw how dominant the adventure package is along with Enforcer. Everyone expected that, but there were some takeaways from pretty much this event that people were not expecting too much, especially from the top cut, because we did see a lot of decks that did really well, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people were not expecting decks like Eldritch or Flanders to do as well as they did. So we also have to take a look at how the adventure package is going to be incorporated in the branded Despia deck, because for that YCS the Albaz Strike structure deck was not out. So for this video we're going to include the branded Despia deck of course as well and see exactly where it stays in the meta, but for that we'll have to wait and see for more results to see exactly how good it is. But for now this is pretty much the top 10 decks that you're going to be seeing the most going forward in the April 2022 meta. Number 10, Adventure Plunder Patrol. Now, Plunder, aside from Prank Kids, I feel like it's the deck that has the most synergy with the Adventure package, just because it's another deck similar to Prank Kids that has no normal summon effects. When you're taking a look at a deck like, for example, like Phantom Knights, you have to go out of your way to link away your Torn Scales and bring it back so you can use its effect. For example, in Branded Despia, you will not be using your Aluber as a normal summon, you have to get to the field with Branded Opening. So there are some contradictions in a lot of decks, but just because of how powerful the adventure package is, they're still played. In this deck, however, there are no contradictions whatsoever. The deck has zero effects for the normal summons and can use this package to its fullest potential, because the weakness of this deck was always that it had a lack of power plays during the early stages of the game and was trying to snowball the advantage. But the thing is that this type of playstyle nowadays it's not the best, but the adventure package basically fixes every problem Plunder Patrol has, and now it has finally managed to become a really good deck that we have seen a lot of people top with it, not in the YCS, but we've seen a lot of regional success for Plunder Patrol, so I feel like it's worth mentioning it as the number 10 deck for the list. Number 9, Sky Striker. Now, I'm including all three versions of Sky Striker because we've seen success with the branded with the Adventure DPE package with a deck. Some people play just DPE, and there are also some pure decks that have been doing well. Now, Sky Striker, the reason it's doing so well with a lot of other engines as well is because of how good the package of Sky Striker is going second. It has tools to deal with pretty much anything. Shark Cannon is an amazing card because of Enforcer being so dominant in the meta. Widow Anchor is always going to be a really good going second card, and just getting one Ray on the board is sometimes enough to force interruptions just because of Hayata Kagari, so you can basically get any card you want, and that means by using just one card you have kept 5 cards in your hand and you're starting to basically chip away at your opponent's board. And the deck going first can do stuff now, because when you're playing pure Striker you have to rely on floodgates or hand traps in order to interrupt your opponent, because with one engage Widow Anchor is not going to be the most consistent card on your board turn 1. So cards like the adventure packets give you more interruptions, and of course Anaconda being able to get you to a monster that can freely destroy itself from the main monster zone to free your back row for the Sky Striker part of the deck makes perfect synergy for the deck. So this is why Sky Striker always finds ways to adapt and incorporate all the powerful strategies, and that's not going to change because in the future we're going to get Therions, which Regulus is an amazing card for Sky Striker. So basically you can expect to see Sky Striker down the road as well, even if the ban list changes a lot of stuff for the stuff we have right now. Number 8, Adventure Dragon Link. Now, Dragon Link is basically very similar to Striker. It's a deck that even though it has been hit so many times in the ban list, as long as it has its main tools, it's basically a very explosive combo deck that can also incorporate stuff like the adventure package, because, for example, you lose cards like Seifert when you play the Water Enchantress or a Mesri combo, but it doesn't matter too much just because there are other ways to play, because you have cards like Chaos Space, Quick Launch, you have so many other cards that can get you to combos. Even Black Metal Dragon is one of those cards, similar to a Prank Kid monster, that you summon. It doesn't get any effect when it's summoned, but it does when it's linked away, so it doesn't contradict with the adventure stuff. So this is why this is another deck that can use this package as well. And I feel like this format, some of the top decks are here only because they are really good with the adventure package, and that's to nobody's surprise. We saw exactly how good this engine is. It just defines the format right now, and I'm curious to see if Konami at all is actually willing to take care of it right now because of how new it is. So maybe the format is going to stay like it is. There's a really good chance of that happening. So this is why these decks, I wouldn't feel very afraid of using them right now, just because I don't feel like the adventure package is going anywhere anytime soon, and Dragon Link is just another one of those decks that has perfect synergy with it. It can do so much with or without the package, depending on your hands. Number 7, Invoke Dogmatic Shadow. Now, this is another deck that took a slight hit in the previous list, but I don't feel like semi-limiting Nadir did so much for the deck, because there are so many other ways to play it. You just have to play more copies of cards like Ecclesia and Maximus, and you basically solve the issue of the ban list. And this deck being able to use cards like Schism Schism to play around anything, because once you get cards like Shekinaga in your extra deck, and we saw a deck that topped because of Gale Dogra, and that's a deck that I'm pretty sure people are going to catch up on and basically use it as nothing else just because of how good it is. Gale Dogra, what it basically does is a replacement of an Adir because it sends both Apkalon and Titanic Light to the graveyard, and it's also an Earth monster, so you can summon Shekinaga with Schism and deal with the adventure token right away. So I feel like this is a deck that's going to drive this deck to higher levels and basically define it as another meta deck again, because always this deck at the beginning of each format, people think that it's going to be an amazing deck, and it never is, but I feel like this time there is a slight chance for this deck to shine a bit more than all the previous formats, just because of this deck and just because of how much people love Shadows in general, and they just love experimenting with them. So it's a deck that people use a lot, so even if it's not the best deck at any given format, it's a deck that you will see a lot just because of the fan base that this deck has. Number 6, Sword Soul Tenny. Now, Sword Soul is another deck that was pushed back to the format just because of the ban list. The limiting of Desires and the banning of Arch Nemesis Protoss basically meant that this deck lost its unfair parts. So the deck is a very mid-range type of deck. Needle Fiber is what pushes this deck to the top just because of how unfair Needle Fiber is with Aurora Dawn, so it can do some other stuff and basically get a free Baron on the field or use Aurora Dawn's effect to pop cards or anything else. So yeah, the combo with 001 is what keeps this deck at the top tables, because I feel like if the ban list serves right and they hit one of those 3 cards, which now Needle Fiber is not going to get banned just because we know it's getting reprinted in Ghost from the Past 2, but if 001 or Aurora Dawn get dealt with, then I feel like Sword Soul is going to take a back seat just because it's one of those decks that it doesn't do anything unfair anymore except from that one part. So if it loses that, then I feel like Sword Soul is basically a Salamangreat type of deck. It's a very consistent deck. It does what it wants to do basically every game, and it can do it with so few cards that it can play a ton of hand traps, but I feel like what it does is so fair compared to what the other decks do, so this is why it cannot actually do so much compared to the other decks. But as long as Needle Fiber and all that stuff are around, this deck does have something explosive to do, especially being able to play around hand traps very well with the engine of the deck like that. So I feel like it's a really good deck. It did top, so it's really good for now, but we'll have to wait and see how the ban list addresses all those issues and how exactly Sword Soul is going to end up. Number 5, Pure Eldritch. Now, Eldritch, I feel like you can play Pure or you can include the Cybers part here, because one Cybers Eldritch deck did really well, and I feel like it's the only deck right now that ended up playing the Artifact Scythe Dagda combo, which was a surprise to everyone because we felt like Scythe was going to be a defining factor for the format, but pretty much everyone dropped it, because I understand why, because it's something that as long as the adventure package is out, even if you lock your opponent out of the extra deck, they will still have something to do with the adventure stuff because they don't need the extra deck to access that part of their deck, and it's so much commitment for something that if it gets negated for something like a droplet or something like that, then you basically lose your entire play, since you have to use your Enforcer to pop your own Scythe, so it's not like you will have your DPE to pop another card during that turn. So this is why I feel like Cybers Eldritch is the one deck that kept it, just because it can do it with one card, and Eldritch is a deck that has infinite grind game. This is why this deck is really good, because when you think of control decks, you can outpace them early game, but the thing is with Eldritch, Floodgates will steal your game early game, and then you're going to lose the grind game because of the Eldritch card. So this is why Pure Eldritch, I feel like it's a bit better than Cybers Eldritch, and this is why it did a little bit better in the YCS as well. But you can play the Cybers version as well if you are more of a combo player, but you still love Eldritch, so you can do both if you want. So you can include both of these decks at the number 5 here, but I do feel like the Pure deck just outshines the Cybers deck just a tiny bit. Number 4, Flanders. Now, this is another deck that is very similar to Eldritch. It's a deck that has basically infinite resources because of how the Flanders work. They get banished when they leave the field, and then you add them back when you summon a Winged Beast, so you basically have infinite resources. But the thing is, this deck does really well because of 2 specific cards that are not even part of the archetype. The first card is Dish Shifter. Of course, Dish Shifter, in any matchup that Dish Shifter hurts them, you're going to win as long as you draw this card, because of how powerful a quick play hand trap Macrocosmos is, basically destroying pretty much anything. So this is why this hand trap is what defines this deck, and also the Barrier Statue. The Barrier Statue, being able to protect it as well, basically means that as long as your opponent is not playing a wind deck, which the only wind defining card right now is Griffon Rider, but doesn't matter because they won't be able to summon the adventure token because that's Earth. So as long as you keep your Barrier Statue on the field, you're going to win most of the matchups, unless you're playing against Pure Eldritch, which is definitely the hardest matchup for Flanders, but I feel like Flanders has a better matchup in general because of Dish Shifter, so this is why I'm putting it at number 4 and Eldritch at number 5. But still, Flanders, the only problem with this deck is its consistency, but cards like Prosperity, the Advent Adventure, and all that stuff basically fixed all that stuff, so this is why Flanders is a really good deck. It's one of those decks that doesn't use any of those other engines, which I kind of respect, because right now, if you're a deck that you can do so well without including cards like DPE or the Adventure Package, I feel like you're a really good deck just because you don't need help from those old broken engines just just like any other deck does, because without these engines they wouldn't be able nearly as good. So this is why Flanders, I have it at number 4, and I feel like that a good ban list would basically skyrocket Flanders to the competitive level just because of how the deck works. It doesn't use any of the engines, and I feel like Konami is not going to go after any specific archetype right now, so this is one of those decks that you can be relying on because it's going to become much better in the future. Number 3, Adventure branded Despia. Now, we have the new deck here at number 3. Now, the thing is that the only thing we can take away right now is basically from the OCG. The OCG has shown us that the Albaz Strike Structure deck will make a huge difference in the format just because of how it's another deck that it can use one-card combos with like Aluber, Branded Fusion, and protect those combos with the Adventure packets from hand traps, and as long as you can keep the momentum going, it's also another deck that's similar to Eldritch. It can infinitely grind because of Lubellion. Being able to shuffle back your monsters means that you can use your Branded Fusion 3 or maybe even 4 times throughout a duel just because of how the deck works. It can set branded spells and traps from the graveyard as well and other stuff. So I feel like this deck, having access to cards like Mirror Jade, Guardian Chimera, it can disrupt your opponent very well. If people start feeling that they lose to decks like Eldritch, they can also incorporate the Dragoon package, which is something that the OCG never had with this deck, but we can experiment with it. So if the deck struggles with control, I feel like Dragoon is a really good option to fight that because cards like Mirror Jade and Guardian Chimera are not so great against Eldritch, but Dragoon is. Dragoon is very hard to deal with when you're playing Eldritch. You have to rely on cards like Skilder and Ice Dragon's Prison, so if you're playing against a skilled opponent and they know not to negate something redundant, then you basically have a very big problem at your hands. So this is why I feel like this deck can pretty much fare well against both combo and control decks, and of how consistent it is and how few resources it takes to use all those cards. It can also play a plethora of hand traps, which is basically the game of this format. If you're not playing 10 to 15 hand traps, then you don't have a chance against this, unless this one hand trap is D-Shifter, which is why Flanders is so good. It's the only deck that can do something with only one hand trap, because it's a hand trap that you can throw at your opponent before they even have the chance to activate Rite of Aramezir, and then you basically stall them for the entire turn. But this deck, it cannot play D-Shifter, but Despia can play every other hand trap in the game, so I feel like this deck is going to be really good. And another reason why I feel like this deck is going to be so represented and why I'm putting it at number 3 is because of the reprint of Aluber. This deck, we thought that it was going to be the most expensive thing ever, especially when you include cards like Pot of Prosperity, which a lot of people are playing, and the Adventure package, which is basically mandatory because if you don't play it, then you basically lose to one Veiler on your Lubellion or your Albion or one Ash on your Branded Fusion. So this deck was supposed to be super expensive, but now it's going to be more budget than we thought just because of Ghost from the Past 2. So people are going to try it out, and this is not just for the pure deck. I feel like the engine is going to be played in a lot of other decks, so even if you don't face pure branded Despia, you're going to see Branded Fusion in a lot of other decks, so you should be prepared for that as well, which is why I'm giving it the number 3 spot. Number 2, Based. Now, this deck, you basically know it as the pile deck, but I feel like it has been more recognized as the Synchro deck for the Adventure just because of the Rose Dragon stuff, but it still doesn't have a clear-cut identity because Rose Dragon is not the archetype you're playing, it's just another engine you put into the deck, so I'm just keep calling it pile for now, just because it's the deck that has all the good engines combined into one, and I feel like the reason this deck is so good, and I'm putting it at number 2, is because of how unpredictable it is. When you're playing against a specific archetype, you know exactly what your opponent is going to do when, and exactly what to counter if you can. For example, you're playing against Prankids, you know that they're going to normal summon a Prankid, go into Meow Meow, and then boom, you have the combo. When you're playing against this deck, you don't know what your opponent is going to do next. For example, they will always be starting with the Adventure packets, but the thing is, when you have cards like the Rose Dragons, when you have Needle Fiber, when you have Magician Souls, DP, you don't know exactly what to counter and what to keep in your hand to try to counter next, which is why I feel like why this deck is so good, because of how unpredictable it is compared to any other pure card archetype, because even though some archetypes are playing a lot of engines, they still have the certain playstyle that the archetype had, even if they were not playing that engine. So Based is why I feel like it's very hard deck to deal with, and I feel like a lot of people are confused when they're playing against this deck, so that's why it has a lot of success. So this is why I'm giving it the number 2 spot on the list. And at number 1, I'm pretty sure everyone knows this already. At number 1, we have Adventure Prankids. Now, we talked about this when I talked about Plunder Patrol. This is a deck that basically can use the Adventure package like no other. It has absolute zero contradictions, and basically, not only does it not contradict the deck, it helps you play around multiple hand traps. It's not like Griffon Rider stopping one hand trap from stopping you. When you have cards like Fateful Adventure, being able to chain block the one Prankid you have in the graveyard when you link it to Meow Meow means that you can play around Ash Blossom, because the Ash Blossom is really good against Prankids only if you stop the first Prankid, but Fateful Adventure stops that completely. And then you, on top of that, you also have the Griffon Rider to play around another hand trap, so this deck is so resilient, so consistent, and we've seen 40 card versions, we've seen 60 card versions. It also plays DPE, which is obviously because DPE is such a powerhouse. Some decks play the Magician's Souls package, which is another card that you can use as an extender for Anaconda and basically get free cards, because the deck does have a lot of redundant spells and traps after you combo. For example, the field spell you don't need on the field after you've searched with it. Maybe the Draco back, sometimes you can basically get it for free back if you haven't used it this turn, so you can get a free draw and you get card back on the field. Yeah, this deck is just so consistent and so powerful, which is why people just decide to play this deck mostly for the event, and we've seen from the results that this is the absolute dominant deck of the format, and I feel like this is what the ban list should focus on, because it's not just all these engines coming together to become some other really good decks. It's the Prank Kids engine that it just becomes unfair to the point that if you can protect this starting play, then the deck has no limits, because the choke point of the deck was always its first activation before the adventure package came out, which is why people were not playing the deck after Meow got limited, but now they don't care that much because the adventure package basically solved all the problems of the deck. So this is why I feel like Prank Kids is going to be the best deck, even with the release of Albaz Strike. As long as we don't get a ban list, then this deck is much better than pretty much anything else in the form. So yep, that's the video, guys. If you have any other ideas about decks that you could think that could come in the top 10 of the meta decks for the upcoming format, because Albaz Strike, we basically included only the pure deck here, but sometimes the pure deck is not always the way to go, and we might see some other fusion types of decks that can use the engine even maybe better than the pure deck, who knows. But for that, we'll have to wait and see. But for now, I feel like these are the 10 decks that you're going to be seeing the most until we get a new ban list. So yep, that's the video, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and we'll see you next time.